On December 7th, 1976, Bob McAdoo scored 42 points and pulled down a career-high 29 rebounds for the Buffalo Braves. 2 days later, the team traded him. He was 25 years old, already a league most valuable player, a Rookie of the Year, and a 3-time scoring champion. One of the most productive young stars in basketball had delivered a monster performance and become someone else's player before the week was over. That exchange became the pattern of McAdoo's career. The numbers said franchise cornerstone. The business kept treating him like a problem to move. Buffalo sent him to New York. New York sent him to Boston. Boston sent him to Detroit. Injuries, contract disputes, and unstable teams kept changing the uniform until a former MVP eventually found himself on crutches, wondering whether the league had finished with him. The strange part is that McAdoo's story contains more than one return from that apparent ending. A Christmas Eve call from the Los Angeles Lakers asked a proud former superstar to become a reserve. He accepted, helped win 2 championships, and rebuilt his reputation. When the NBA moved on again, he crossed the Atlantic and became a champion and Final Four most valuable player in Europe. So the question is larger than why Bob McAdoo was traded so often. It is how a player who averaged 34.5 points and 14.1 rebounds in an MVP season could be treated as disposable, and how he kept finding new ways to prove that the judgment was wrong. His career was not one clean rise and fall. It was a series of removals, followed by reinvention. Before the trades, titles, and second lives, he was a boy in Greensboro, North Carolina, whose mother opposed his decision to accept professional money. The family argument around that choice is where the first great turn in Bob McAdoo's story began. Robert Allen McAdoo Jr. was born on September 25, 1951, in Greensboro, North Carolina. And to understand the man, you have to understand the house he came from, because it was a working household that took education and effort seriously. His mother, Vandalia, was a teacher, and she taught at his own grade school. Bob walked those hallways, knowing his mother was somewhere in the building, expecting the same seriousness from him that she expected from her students. His father, Robert, worked as a custodian at North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University, the historically black university in Greensboro. A teacher and a custodian gave their son a close view of education from opposite sides of the institution, and both understood the value of showing up and doing the work. That was the foundation under young Bob McAdoo, and what grew out of it was a kid with more range than anybody expected. At Ben L. Smith High School, he played the sport that would make him famous, but he also played saxophone in the marching band. Before the scoring titles, those hands were learning music as well as a jump shot. The detail matters because the future superstar was never only an athlete. Basketball would become his public language, but it was not the only one he possessed. And then there was track. McAdoo was a genuine dual-threat athlete, the kind of explosive talent you do not see often. As a senior, he led Ben L. Smith all the way to the state basketball semifinals, but he was also the state high jump champion. And he did not just win, he set a new state record, clearing 6 feet 7 3/4 inches. In doing it, he beat a young man named Bobby Jones, who would later become his teammate at North Carolina and a respected NBA player in his own right. 6 feet 7 3/4 inches off the ground. That is the athleticism that would one day make him nearly impossible to guard. But there was a problem standing between this gifted young man and a Division I scholarship, and it had nothing to do with what he could do on a court or a track. Here was the obstacle. Coming out of Ben L. Smith High School, Bob McAdoo did not have the academic test scores that Division I programs required at the time. The talent was undeniable. The athleticism was off the charts. But the numbers on a piece of paper said the front door to big-time college basketball was closed, at least for now. So McAdoo did what a lot of young men in his position had to do. He took the side door. He enrolled at Vincennes University, a junior college in Vincennes, Indiana, where he played from 1969 through 1971. And he did not waste the detour. He turned it into a launching pad. In 1970, Vincennes won the National Junior College Athletic Association Men's Division I Basketball Championship. And in that championship game, McAdoo poured in 27 points. This was not a young man hiding from the moment because he had been overlooked. This was a young man proving on a national junior college stage that wherever you put him, he was going to dominate. His roommate during those Vincennes days was Foots Walker, who would go on to his own career as an NBA guard. But this detour is bigger than just a couple of seasons in Indiana. Look closely, and you can already see the pattern that would shadow McAdoo for the rest of his basketball life. He kept arriving by the side door. He kept having to prove he belonged before anyone would simply hand him a seat at the table. The junior college, the eligibility question. Always one extra hurdle, always one more thing to overcome before the doubters would let him in. And that junior college stop, that thing that made him an outlier, an exception, a player who took the unusual road. It caught the eye of a coach who had never recruited a player quite like him before. A coach who, by reputation, never would again. The coach was Dean Smith. The school was the University of North Carolina. And the distinction is remarkable, because by reputation, McAdoo was the only junior college player Dean Smith ever recruited to Chapel Hill. The exception mattered. Dean Smith built one of the most respected programs in college basketball by recruiting elite high school players and developing them inside a particular system. Junior colleges were not his usual route. McAdoo's talent persuaded him to depart from that pattern, and the decision told the basketball world that this was not an ordinary transfer looking for a larger stage. He was a player important enough to make a great coach reconsider his own method, and McAdoo rewarded that faith almost immediately. He enrolled at North Carolina in 1971, and in his one season in Chapel Hill, he helped lead Dean Smith's 1971-72 Tar Heels to a 26-5 record and a trip to the Final Four. One season. That is all it took for him to make his mark at the highest level of college basketball on one of the sport's biggest stages. But the relationship between McAdoo and Dean Smith would turn out to be about far more than wins and losses. Smith became a mentor, a trusted voice, and very soon he would become the man who blessed the single most controversial decision of McAdoo's young life, a decision that would tear right through his own family. Because after just one season in Chapel Hill, with all that promise in front of him, Bob McAdoo made a choice that split his household in two. And the loudest voice raised against it belonged to the woman who had watched him grow up in the hallways of his own grade school, his mother. Here was the turning point that changed everything. Citing family hardship, Bob McAdoo sought and won early eligibility for the 1972 NBA draft, taking advantage of the so-called hardship clause that existed in the league until 1977. In plain terms, it meant a player whose family was struggling could leave college early and turn professional instead of being forced to wait. For a young man whose father swept floors at a university and whose mother taught grade school, the money on the table was life-changing. But the decision did not land softly. It split the McAdoo household right down the middle. His mother, Vandalia, was totally against it. His father, Robert, supported it, and so did Dean Smith. McAdoo himself laid the whole thing bare years later. In his own words, he remembered it like this: "When I left, a lot of people were very angry and upset. But Dean gave me his blessing. He told me, if they're going to offer you this kind of money, I think you should leave to help you and your family. My mother was totally against it, but my father and Dean Smith were the guys who got me to move." A young man, barely out of his teens, was standing between the two people who raised him, one telling him to stay, one telling him to go, while a college coach argued that the money was too important to turn down. The expected path was to finish his degree at North Carolina. The other path offered immediate security to the working family that had given him everything, but it came with anger and hurt inside that same home. McAdoo knew people would be, in his words, very angry and upset. He chose the professional game anyway. And just as he stepped toward that 1972 draft, a strange and murky rumor began to swirl around his name. Talk of a secret signing, a contract that may have been voided, and a reported warning from the very top of the league telling teams to stay away from Bob McAdoo entirely. Here is where the story gets murky, and we have to walk carefully because some of what happened around that 1972 draft was never cleanly settled. What is clear is that as Bob McAdoo prepared to turn professional, a strange rumor attached itself to his name and would not let go. The talk was this. It was reported that McAdoo had quietly signed with the Virginia Squires of the American Basketball Association, the rival league to the NBA at the time, following what was described as a kind of secret ABA draft. Now here is the catch. No contract was ever produced. McAdoo himself denied the whole thing. But the rumor alone was enough to throw a shadow over draft night. And that is the part worth sitting with. In professional basketball, sometimes a rumor with no paper behind it can do almost as much damage as the truth. And it apparently traveled all the way to the top. According to the account that has followed McAdoo for decades, NBA Commissioner Walter Kennedy reportedly advised teams not to draft him. A young man who had just helped take North Carolina to a Final Four entered draft night with enormous upside and with a reported warning from the commissioner's office hanging over his name. Now we have to be honest about what this is. This is a disputed story, a reported dispute with competing versions and no clean resolution. Treat it as exactly that, a rumor that complicated his draft status, not a settled fact carved in stone. But here is the thing about that draft. Whatever the cloud, one team decided it was worth the gamble. The Buffalo Braves took Bob McAdoo with the number 2 overall pick. The only player chosen ahead of him was LaRue Martin, who went first to the Portland Trail Blazers, a name basketball historians still bring up when they talk about draft day decisions that aged in unexpected ways. So Buffalo ignored the noise. They ignored the rumor, the supposed warning, the whole tangled mess. They got their man. And within 2 short years, that man would turn a struggling franchise into appointment television and turn himself into the most feared scorer in the entire National Basketball Association. When Bob McAdoo arrived in Buffalo, he walked into a franchise that was not built to win. and from almost the first moment, you could feel how much that bothered him. Some players accept losing as the cost of being young. McAdoo never did. He carried a kind of impatience that bordered on disgust, and he was never shy about saying so. On the floor, though, the talent was immediate and undeniable. In his very first season, McAdoo won the 1973 Rookie of the Year award and earned a spot on the NBA All-Rookie First Team. On a weak Braves team that had no business being competitive, the rookie was already a force. That is the strange tension that would define so much of his early career. Extraordinary individual brilliance parked on a roster that simply could not keep up with him. And McAdoo did not sugarcoat the situation. Years later, he described that rookie year with a bluntness that has stuck with basketball fans ever since. In his words, "Here I was sitting at Buffalo. We were on the way to losing 61 games, and we didn't have any players. My wife could have outrun those people. My wife could have outrun those people." That is not the line of a man making peace with his circumstances. That is the line of a competitor who felt trapped, who knew exactly how good he was and exactly how little help he had around him. There is humor in it, sure, but underneath the humor is real frustration. A young man stacking up brilliant numbers night after night and watching the losses pile up anyway. This is the theme that would haunt almost the entire arc of his story. The greatness was real. The wins were not always there. And the toll of that gap, the toll of being magnificent on teams that could not finish the job, started building from the very beginning. It would follow him from city to city, from front office to front office, long after Buffalo. But before the trades, before the carousel, before any of the heartbreak, there came an explosion. A sophomore season so overwhelming, so complete, that half a century later, no player in the league has been able to match what Bob McAdoo did on a basketball court. What happened next belongs in a category almost by itself. In the 1973-74 season, only his second year in the league, Bob McAdoo did something that has stood as a marker ever since. He averaged better than 30 points and better than 15 rebounds per game across the full season. Both. At the same time, it is a feat that had not been matched since by any player in the National Basketball Association. The game has changed repeatedly since that season. Scoring has risen, spacing has widened, and generations of exceptional rebounders have entered the league. Still, that combined 30 and 15 line from McAdoo's second year remains unmatched. He also led the league in field goal percentage at 54.7%. The scoring champion was simultaneously its most accurate shooter from the field, an unusual combination of volume and efficiency in any era. And then came the crown. In the 1974-75 season, McAdoo was named the most valuable player of the National Basketball Association. The numbers behind that honor are staggering, averaging 34.5 points, 14.1 rebounds, and better than 2 blocks a game, while shooting 51.2% from the floor. By that point, he had also strung together 3 consecutive scoring titles, a run that began all the way back in his second season. 3 straight years as the most prolific scorer in the league. But here is the cruel wrinkle that ran through even his finest hour. That MVP season, with strong play from Jim McMillian and Randy Smith, the Braves finished 49-33. In the Eastern Conference semifinals, they met Elvin Hayes, Wes Unseld, and the Washington Bullets, a heavyweight opponent that pushed the series to 7 games. Game 4 supplied one of the clearest answers to anyone who wondered whether McAdoo's regular season production could survive playoff pressure. On April 18, 1975, in Buffalo's Memorial Auditorium, he scored 50 points and collected 21 rebounds in a nationally televised victory. He made 20 of 32 shots, while the defense knew precisely where Buffalo's offense was going. 50 and 21 in a playoff game. No NBA player has produced that combination in the postseason since. The line matters beyond its rarity. It came against the team that eventually won the series, with Wes Unseld and Elvin Hayes occupying the front line. McAdoo was not decorating a losing season with empty numbers. Against elite playoff competition, he produced a game that remained unmatched for more than half a century. Buffalo still lost the series in 7. That is the tension of his peak in one frame. The most valuable player in basketball delivered a historic postseason performance, yet another franchise advanced. His individual greatness was not the question. Whether the Braves could turn it into a lasting contender was. And the next chapter of that pattern arrived in the most jarring way imaginable. On December 7th, 1976, he pulled down a career-high 29 rebounds. 2 days later, the franchise he had carried decided he was someone else's problem. The timing of it is almost hard to believe, even now. On December 7th, 1976, in a game against the Indiana Pacers, Bob McAdoo put together a monster night. 42 points, and that career-high 29 rebounds. 29 rebounds in a single game. That is the kind of performance that is supposed to remind everyone exactly what you mean to a basketball team. Even in a loss, it was a statement of dominance. 2 days later, on December 9th, Buffalo traded him away. The return looked startling. McAdoo and Tom McMillan went to New York for John Gianelli and cash. But the transaction had an ownership context that makes it more understandable and more disturbing. John Y. Brown Jr. had recently purchased the Braves, and historical accounts of the sale describe an arrangement under which money received in player deals reduced what Brown owed former owner Paul Snyder. Buffalo was not making a pure judgment about whether McAdoo could still play. The economics of the franchise itself rewarded turning valuable contracts into cash. That does not explain every later move, but it answers the first one. A 42-point, 29-rebound performance could not protect McAdoo, because the decision was not driven only by the court. The trade converted the team's greatest player into a useful piece, immediate money, and financial relief connected to a change in ownership. McAdoo experienced it as rejection. Buffalo's books treated it as a transaction. And the numbers he left behind in Buffalo only sharpened the question. In 334 games with the Braves, McAdoo averaged 28.2 points, 12.7 rebounds, and 2.4 blocks per game. Those are franchise cornerstone numbers. Those are the numbers of a player a city is supposed to protect. New York, therefore, promised more than a larger market. It offered McAdoo the chance to separate his basketball value from the financial dismantling in Buffalo. The Knicks had recognizable names and a proud history, but they were also moving between eras. Walt Frazier and Earl Monroe belonged to the championship identity of the early 70s. Spencer Haywood and McAdoo represented an attempt to remain relevant while that foundation changed beneath them. McAdoo continued to score. In 1977 to 78, he averaged 26.5 points, third in the league. That is not the production of a star whose talent had collapsed. Yet the Knicks did not become a contender around him, and the burden he later described followed him. Every new team expected the former MVP to become a franchise saver immediately. On February 12, 1979, New York traded him to Boston for Tom Barker and 3 first-round picks. The return is crucial because it contradicts the idea that the league simply considered McAdoo worthless. Boston paid heavily. Teams still coveted the scoring, but they kept acquiring him as an answer to an urgent problem, rather than placing him inside a stable, long-term design. That distinction explains more than the word discarded ever could. Buffalo's decision was tangled in ownership economics. New York received major draft capital while searching for its next identity. Boston's move was initiated by owner John Y. Brown Jr., without the full support of general manager Red Auerbach or player-coach Dave Cowens. McAdoo was valuable enough to command 3 first-round selections and vulnerable enough to enter a locker room where the basketball leadership had not agreed on bringing him in. He later described the emotional result with unusual clarity. Every stop expected him to do the scoring, collect the rebounds, and rescue the franchise. The uniform changed, but the assignment did not. When the rescue failed, the next front office could turn his remaining value into its own version of the future. Boston would prove how dangerous that kind of acquisition could be. McAdoo arrived with the price tag of a major star, but without unified support inside the franchise. A roster shakeup and the arrival of a rookie from Indiana State would close his path in green almost before it had properly opened. On paper, landing in Boston should have felt like a promotion. This was one of the proudest addresses in professional basketball, a franchise that knew how to win banners. But the chapter Bob McAdoo lived there was short, awkward, and ultimately a failed fit. Under player-coach Dave Cowens, the team simply was not good. Boston finished that stretch at 29-53, a losing record that did nothing to help McAdoo's reputation. And inside a crowded front court, his minutes were squeezed. He averaged 20.6 points and 7.1 rebounds. Still useful production, still the work of a gifted scorer, but a far cry from the towering numbers he had put up in Buffalo. For a man who had once led the league, watching his rebounding nearly cut in half was its own quiet humiliation. Then came the structural squeeze that finished any future he might have had in green. After the season, Boston moved on from Cowens as coach and brought in Bill Fitch. Then arrived the rookie from Indiana State, a young forward named Larry Bird. McAdoo was only 27, not an aging player, but he was costly, and his role no longer fit a team rebuilding its identity around a generational talent. Boston had acquired him as an immediate solution and was now organizing its future around someone else. On September 6, 1979, Boston traded McAdoo to Detroit for 2 more first-round picks. Again, the price showed that his talent retained real value. The problem was the purpose attached to it. Boston wanted draft capital for a new era. Detroit wanted an established scorer to lift a team already in trouble. McAdoo was not entering a settled contender. He was being assigned another rescue. Detroit was supposed to give him a defined role and a place to silence the growing questions. Instead, it exposed the next reason his standing fell. Not ownership economics or an incoming superstar this time, but a public conflict over health, conditioning, practice, and whether he was ready to play. Instead, it became the lowest, ugliest moment of his entire career. It would end with a coach, a general manager, and one cold sentence that no proud athlete ever wants to hear. Don't come back. Detroit started the way so many of McAdoo's stops did, on a team that could not win. The 1979-80 Pistons were dreadful, finishing 16-66. And yet, even there, McAdoo could still score. Playing alongside the great Bob Lanier, a Hall of Fame center in his own right, McAdoo averaged 21.1 points over 58 games. The talent had not vanished. The ability to put the ball in the basket was still very much intact. But it was the following season that everything came apart. And it came apart in public. What unfolded next has been told as a reported sequence of events, and it is worth narrating exactly that way. On February 19, 1981, McAdoo, insisting that he was healthy, asked to be put back into the starting lineup. His coach, Scotty Robertson, refused. Robertson's stated reason was blunt. McAdoo had not been practicing and, in his judgment, was not in proper physical condition to play. McAdoo, frustrated, asked to go home, and he was allowed to leave. The next day, the situation hardened into something close to an exile. According to the account that has followed him, Pistons general manager Jack McCloskey told McAdoo plainly not to return. And on March 11, 1981, the Pistons waived him outright. He had played in just 6 games that entire season. The dispute changed how other teams could interpret him. Only a handful of years after his MVP season, McAdoo was being discussed not simply as an injured player, but as a veteran whose coach questioned his practice time and physical condition. McAdoo said he was healthy. Detroit's staff disagreed. Whatever the full truth inside that relationship, the public result was damaging. Front offices no longer had to evaluate only his scoring. They had to decide whether the role, body, and reputation still justified the cost. That is how a former MVP reached the margins without one simple verdict against him. Financial motives moved him out of Buffalo. Organizational transition moved him out of New York and Boston. The Detroit confrontation added doubts about availability and fit. Each episode had a different cause, but together they produced the same outcome. McAdoo was waived and searching for work. He signed with the New Jersey Nets 2 days later, hoping one more uniform might provide a place to recover. But a contract dispute and a surgeon's knife were waiting for him. And soon, a former scoring champion would find himself standing on crutches, staring straight at the end of the road. The New Jersey stop barely registers in the box scores, and that is exactly the point. McAdoo signed with the Nets as a free agent on March 13, 1981, and played just 10 games for them, logging only around 15 minutes a night. 15 minutes. For a man who had once dominated entire seasons, who had once been the league's premier scorer, that reduction tells you everything about how far his standing had fallen. He had gone from a franchise centerpiece to a fringe contributor, hanging on at the very margins of the roster. And then it got worse. As the next season approached, McAdoo found himself trapped between 2 enemies that had nothing to do with his talent. The first was a contract dispute with the Nets. The second was his own body. He underwent off-season surgery to remove bone spurs from his foot, and the recovery was long, slow, and demoralizing. For months he was on crutches, unable to play, unable to even prove he still belonged. And in his own words, the doubt crept all the way in. He admitted there were times, standing around on crutches for months, when he thought his career was over. This was the emotional bottom of the story. A damaged reputation, a contract fight that froze his career in place, and a surgically repaired foot that left him leaning on crutches instead of running the floor. At barely 30, an age when many great players still have valuable seasons left, Bob McAdoo looked finished from the outside. The former MVP had become a cautionary tale before he had decided that his playing life was over. There was no obvious way back, no team clamoring for his services, no reason for anyone to believe the next chapter would be anything but a slow fade into retirement. And then, on Christmas Eve, the phone rang. On the other end was the one organization in basketball that could take a discarded, doubted, broken down former scoring champion and turn him into something he had never been in his entire career: a champion. The call came from the Los Angeles Lakers, and the timing of it was almost cinematic. As McAdoo himself told the story, it landed on Christmas Eve. The Lakers had a problem. They had just lost a key contributor, Mitch Kupchak, who had blown out his knee. They needed a big man who could step in and produce off the bench, and they were willing to take a chance on a player most of the league had written off. In McAdoo's own words, he laid out the whole moment. As the 1981-82 season began, I was in the middle of a contract dispute with the New Jersey Nets. I couldn't even play since I was still recovering from off-season surgery to have bone spurs removed from my foot. There were times, standing around on crutches for months, when I thought my career was over. But I got a call from the Lakers on Christmas Eve. They had just lost a key player, Mitch Kupchak, who blew out his knee. In the short term, they were hoping I could fill his void coming off the bench. Coming off the bench. There it was, the opportunity and the catch wrapped together. On one hand, this was a golden door swinging open. A chance to finally play alongside Magic Johnson and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, with a real, genuine shot at the one thing that had eluded him through every brilliant season and every painful trade: a championship. On the other hand, the role stung. This was a former league most valuable player being asked to be a reserve, and McAdoo never pretended otherwise. He admitted the truth of it plainly. I had no thoughts at all in my mind about coming off the bench. It just happened. He went on to describe the deeper bargain he was making. It was a great opportunity for me to play with Kareem and Magic. For the first time in my career, I had a chance to win a championship. But I had no thoughts at all in my mind about coming off the bench. I dealt with it because I had never been on a championship team, and I've never been one to cause disruption or anything like that. That is the quiet, mature sacrifice that quietly rewrote his entire legacy. A proud former superstar, a man used to carrying teams, choosing to swallow his ego for a chance at the ring he had never worn. And it would pay off faster than even he could have imagined. The gamble worked almost immediately, and the redemption was real. In his first season with Los Angeles, McAdoo became exactly what the Lakers had hoped for: a dangerous scoring weapon coming off the bench for one of the most thrilling teams the sport had ever produced. And he delivered when it mattered most. In the 1982 NBA Finals, McAdoo averaged 16.3 points in roughly 27 minutes a game as the Lakers defeated Philadelphia in 6. This was not a ceremonial role for a famous name. The man who had thought his career was over while leaning on crutches only months earlier had become a major contributor on the championship stage. After brilliant individual seasons, followed by early exits and abrupt trades, Bob McAdoo finally had a ring. What makes it land even harder is the role he accepted to get there. This was a former scoring champion, watching less decorated teammates take the spots ahead of him. Players like Jim Brewer, Mark Landsberger, and Kurt Rambis. For a man who had once been the most feared offensive force in the league, sitting behind those names had to grate. He carried a quiet, private frustration about not starting, but he buried it for the good of the team, and the championship was his reward. His commitment to that choice ran deeper than one season. McAdoo re-signed with the Lakers for the next campaign, declining a more lucrative offer from Philadelphia in order to remain in Los Angeles. Earlier in life, family hardship had made professional money impossible to ignore. Now he left money on the table to preserve something his larger contracts had never guaranteed: a defined role, a stable contender, and the realistic chance to keep winning. He had remade himself. The discarded problem had become a glue piece on a dynasty. But the road to a second ring would not be smooth, because the next season would test his body all over again, forcing him to play through serious pain and pushing his coach to deliver a verdict that still echoes through this story. The next spring tested Bob McAdoo in a way that statistics alone can never fully capture. In the 1983 playoffs, he played through a severely injured hamstring, the kind of injury that robs a big man of everything that makes him dangerous: the burst, the lift, the ability to rise over a defender and finish. And yet, he kept playing. He kept putting his body on the line for a team that had come to lean on him far more than the casual fan ever realized. The Lakers lost that postseason to Philadelphia, and Pat Riley's assessment revealed McAdoo's importance. If we could have had Mac healthy, we might have had a shot. The head coach of a championship organization, surrounded by Hall of Fame talent, believed the series might have changed if his veteran reserve's leg had held up. For a player whose availability and commitment had once been questioned publicly, Riley's confidence supplied a quiet form of vindication. And the value held. His 13.1 scoring average in 1983-84 led all NBA non-starters, even though he played fewer than 21 minutes a night. Limited time had not removed the old scoring instinct, it had concentrated it. The former centerpiece was now asked to change a game in short bursts, and no other reserve in the league produced more points per appearance. Then came the full repayment. In 1985, serving as the sixth man for one of the greatest teams ever assembled, McAdoo helped close out a championship that meant even more than the first. In that finals, he averaged 8.2 points and 3 rebounds a game, and across the entire playoff run, he chipped in 11.4 points a night. A second ring, a second crown for a man who only a few years earlier had been written off as finished. The rehabilitation of his name, at least in basketball terms, looked complete. 2 titles, a respected veteran on a dynasty, a coach publicly declaring how much the team depended on him. But even a 2-time champion can be deemed disposable. And after that 1985 title, Los Angeles made a decision that sent him searching for a basketball home one final time. The reward for sacrifice in professional basketball is often a thank you and a closing door. After the 1985 championship, the Lakers chose not to bring McAdoo back. Instead, they handed his sixth-man role to a veteran named Maurice Lucas. Just like that, the man who had played through a torn hamstring for them, who had buried his pride for the good of the group, who had won them 2 titles as a reserve, was no longer part of the plan. This departure was not the same as Buffalo's sale or Detroit's confrontation. There was no mystery to solve. The Lakers chose a different veteran for the role as their roster evolved. McAdoo had restored his reputation and helped win twice. But even successful partnerships in professional sports can end when a team decides the next version requires someone else. So he caught on for one last American chapter, signing with the Philadelphia 76ers for the 1985-86 season. And on paper, the company was extraordinary. He shared a locker room with Julius Erving, Moses Malone, and a young Charles Barkley, a front court loaded with present and future Hall of Fame names. Across 29 games, McAdoo averaged 10.1 points. Still useful, still capable of contributing, but clearly now in the twilight, a complementary piece on a crowded roster rather than a centerpiece anyone built around. The end, when it came, was quiet and razor-thin. The final game of his NBA career was a Game 7 semifinal loss to the Milwaukee Bucks, decided by a single basket, 113-112. In that last appearance on an American floor, McAdoo scored 7 points and grabbed 4 rebounds. A narrow defeat, a modest line, a subdued exit for a career that had once been pure thunder. Rookie of the Year, an MVP, 3 straight scoring crowns. For most players, that is where the story ends. The body slows, the role shrinks, the final buzzer sounds, and a great career fades into memory and highlight reels. Most observers assumed the same about Bob McAdoo. They were wrong, because he was about to do something almost no American star of his era had even attempted: rebuild his name a second time, on a different continent, in a different league, and prove all over again that he had never stopped being a winner. At an age when most stars are content to retire, settle down, and let the trophies tell the story, Bob McAdoo did something genuinely bold. He packed up and moved to Italy, joining Olimpia Milano and throwing himself into a completely different brand of basketball, in a country far from the gyms and arenas that had made his name. And he did not go quietly into a comfortable victory lap. He went and dominated. McAdoo played for Olimpia Milano from the 1986-87 season through 1989-90, anchoring the club at the height of European basketball. He led Milano to 2 straight EuroLeague championships, known then as the FIBA European Champions Cup, winning it in 1986-87 and again in 1987-88, back-to-back continental titles. And in 1988, he was named the EuroLeague Final Four Most Valuable Player, the standout performer on the biggest stage the European game had to offer. Italy did not ask McAdoo to explain every American trade before allowing him to matter. Olimpia Milano asked whether he could still perform, and he answered with championships and a Final Four Most Valuable Player award. The questions that had followed him through Detroit and New Jersey about his body, role, and commitment lost their force when measured against what he was producing on the floor an ocean away. He would spend his final 7 seasons in Italy's top division, extending a playing career that stretched across an astonishing 21 years in all. And when you step back and add it up, McAdoo landed in rare company indeed. He became one of the few players in the history of the sport to win both an NBA championship and a EuroLeague title as a player. A man who had spent so much of his life being told in one way or another that he did not quite fit, had now conquered the highest levels of professional basketball on 2 different continents. When McAdoo finally hung up his shoes, the old question had become more precise. He had never lacked value. Buffalo, New York, Boston, Detroit, Los Angeles, and Milano had all used that value differently, under different pressures. The instability came from the repeated mismatch between what a team urgently wanted from him and the place it was willing to give him once the emergency passed. Formal recognition eventually caught up with the evidence. In 2000, Bob McAdoo entered the Naismith Basketball Hall of Fame. In 2021, he was named to the NBA 75th anniversary team. Those honors did not retroactively make every trade foolish or every conflict one-sided. They established something more durable. None of the movement could reduce an MVP, 3 scoring titles, a historic 50-21 playoff game, and championships on 2 continents to the label of a difficult former star. One relationship also outlasted the playing years: the alliance with Pat Riley, first built during the Showtime seasons, continued with the Miami Heat. McAdoo became an assistant coach and added championships in 2006, 2012, and 2013. His knowledge now mattered without requiring his body to absorb another season. The scorer who had once been asked to rescue unstable teams helped Riley prepare other players for the moments that define them. The total career resists a simple rise and fall summary. The custodian's son from Greensboro entered major college basketball through junior college, left North Carolina through the hardship rule, became Rookie of the Year, then produced an MVP season of 34.5 points and 14.1 rebounds. He later accepted a reserve role, won twice with the Lakers, dominated in Italy, and spent decades coaching. Each reinvention required a different form of pride. First, the confidence to demand the ball, then the humility to contribute without starting, and finally, the patience to teach. Bob McAdoo kept entering through side doors, but he never remained outside for long. The front entrance had been blocked by test scores, draft rumors, ownership economics, injuries, and changing rosters. His answer was not a speech about being misunderstood. It was 50 points and 21 rebounds, 2 NBA titles, 2 European crowns, a Hall of Fame induction, and 3 more rings from the Miami bench. Teams kept deciding what they needed him to become. The lasting achievement is that McAdoo kept deciding for himself what came next.